Thank you to everyone, and especially Hannah Hurling. Consider yourselves warned. An assembly of zombies, the living dead, ghosts, avatars, and possessed peoples has taken over where the live bodies of artists took their proud place as performers, bravely occupying galleries and museums, which had hitherto entombed the no longer living art objects of the ages. An early sighting appeared to a group of historically minded and eager supplicants at a short history of performance, part 1, at the appropriately Gothic Whitechapel Gallery in London in 2002, an event that marked the beginning of these hauntings. With that event, benchmark works from the 1960s and 1970s by Stuart Brisley, Herman Nitsch, Bruce MacLean, and Janis Kournelis encountered the tradition of art history in the form of reperformance. The careful reconstruction of performance works from that most vibrant of decades, the long 60s. By 2004, Rosalie Goldberg's biennial Performa Festival in New York City had enshrined the form. Within the decade, carefully constructed performances of Alan Kaprow's benchmark 18 Happenings in 6 Parts and Fluids, and Marina Abramovich's 7 Easy Pieces and The Artist is Present had ushered in a new era of performance art history, the era of the ghost, the zombie, and the avatar. Welcome to the House of the Living Dead. In this photograph, for example, we see Alan Kaprow in a famous portrait that shows his fascination with the mystery of his image and light traveling through plastic immediately prior to one performance of 18 Happenings in 6 Parts. He appears here as a young man behind a sheet of plastic, the crisp lines of his body dispersed by the passage of light through a semi-transparent medium, rendering him in a ghostly soft focus while the match withers, the match as life's breath inflamed and extinguished over and over. At the time of the picture's taking, Kaprow was, of course, a youthful, healthy 31 years old and the erstwhile inventor of the happening, a newly named art form, a form of performance which, by his instruction, could never be repeated. Leaping forward in time, past Kaprow's grueling battle with cancer and death at 78 in 2006, young performers repeated his gesture of the burned and extinguished flame in precise duplication and without any apparent intervention of their own selfhood. A medium is, of course, necessary for such supernatural events as possessions. For this, the Deitch Group's careful historical research was paramount, as my own attendance and testimony-based verification of resemblance to the original attests. The space and timing felt right to the photographs I have seen of the original. This benchmark artist, long lost to the distancing effects of history, subject to the smoothing finish of the glossy documentary photograph, and usually seen through the gauzy mist of the 1960s avant-garde's faded youth, was finally, by one critic's account, preserved in the flesh. Clearly, the ghost of Kaprow found pride of place in the young performer. Perhaps he was attracted by the space, since Deitch Projects, a warehouse in Long Island City, New York, exactly duplicated the dimensions of the Rubin Gallery. But the original work featured performers, including Alan Kaprow, with Rosalind Montague, Shirley Pendergast, Lucas Samaras, Janet Weinberger, Robert Whitman, Sam Francis, Red Grooms, George Siegel, and others, including my father, Dick Higgins. As far as I could tell, none of the other ghosts made an appearance. though I'd hoped for a visit with Dick, who had died about 8 years earlier. As part of a privileged audience, we bore witness to the production of a possession in both senses of the term. The performer of Caprow was as much possessed by the ghost of Caprow as we, the audience, bore witness to the production of a performance as a thing, a possession that can be shaped in its own past image, essentially restored to a picture of its former self using elaborate staging and light effects. Careful reconstruction has the power to produce audience access to the having been there that they missed by virtue of historic accident or date of birth. The clamor of the audience after the piece supports this idea. So this is what it was like. This is what it was really like. Was it this slow moving? These cards are telling me where to sit, just like the first time. Now I've seen it. In the intervening years, the frequency of Caprow's ghost's appearance picked up pace. Caprow appeared 5 times from April 22nd to April 26, 2008, at Lace in Los Angeles, amid plastic sheets and folding chairs that carefully set the tone for his appearance. As in all seances, an important artifact of the deceased was required to invite his appearance and to add the gloss of authenticity to the seance. In this case, the notebook containing Caprow's sketches for 18 happenings was the magnetic object. The book is a testimonial to the personalizing effects of decision-making, to the facial expressions of performers and artists, to scalable drawings that include visitors then and now, and to the sense that each page bears the marks of a human soul at work. Like many of the artists, generations of writers on performance have railed against these ghosts, arguing that the performance artist need not be a unified, wholly present subject, a prerequisite for ghosts, but that, after the performance, the work exists exclusively through its documentation and detritus. In ecclesiastical terms, this would roughly parallel the injunction against graven images and relics. Emilia Jones, for example, has turned a deft hand to critiquing the nostalgic yearning for the past that is fundamental to the ghost's appearance. She wrote in 1997, arguably in anticipation of these hauntings, quote, "I approach body artworks through their photographic, textual, oral, video, and/or film traces. It is precisely the relationship of these bodies' subjects to documentation, or more specifically to representation, that most profoundly points to the dislocation of the fantasy of the fixed, normative, centered, modernist subject." By this logic, the documentation's mediating effects separate the work from the artist's physical appearances. Perversely enough, the constant circulation of the photographic trace has had precisely the effect Jones hoped it did not. As used in exhibition with the artist or their artifacts close at hand, the photographs amplify and attenuate the presence of the original performer over time. It could even be argued that on occasion, this magnifying aura leaps from the page and the personhood of the artist gains an ever-increasing power. Odd as it sounds, this process, the housing of the artist ensnared in photographs and then present again in the now, does not require the actual death of the performance artist to occur. Far from it. As the archival traces of performance have entered museums, reperformance has become a potent tool in conferring added value to the archive and imbuing the space with the impregnating aura of the artist's emerging ghost. More zombie than ghost, perhaps, in the sense of the living death of the artist, this mutually reinforcing schematic simultaneously absorbs a nostalgic image of the past into an ever more voracious present experience, the past feeling ever more present in the present. The photo, the historic documentation, and the live person produce a heady experiential cocktail that, following the analogy with extreme sport, could be called the extreme now. Indeed, if the artist is sick or aging, this formation could also be said to evoke futurity, the artist's future death encased meaningfully and bodily in the present by way of the viewer's hyper-awareness of time's flow. As this artist said of her high-risk performances in the past, "I was prepared to die." End quote. Carrie Lambert Beatty's candid critique of the artist as present demonstrates as much. After describing the resonance between the historic images and performances in the exhibition, Lambert Beatty ends with the following observation. Abramovich is a brilliant artist, an electrifying performer, and an art historical legend. Must she be both martyr and superstar as well? End quote. Carefully framed to avoid interactions with the artist as a flesh and blood everyday person, the quasi-religious formality of the performance yielded a hushed quiet, the reverential awe of martyrdom. The audience waited in rapt attention for their time with this martyred superstar. The use of the word martyr here is no accident. Living like this, in a red sleeve as still as the plain table and chair whose right angles mirror her own, for a religious cause, in this case the service of timeless narratives regarding the eternal value of art, even and especially performance art. Instead of worrying for her safety or extending oneself to defend her, as accounts of her historic work where she was crowded out, cut, or burned describe, this time the living artist was systematically bracketed from the audience experience by virtue of a certain formality and a wealth of documentation, which essentially function here as transfer objects for a zombie impregnated by the image of her former self. Like the nested rooms of ancient funerary monuments, inside the square walls of the museum space, another box, then another, inside which the visitor's line formed an obedient queue, kept to the margins by another, bold line, an invisible wall that set the stage for the quiet, regimented, idealized encounter. I am reminded of the pictures of mourners waiting in line to mourn their dead. So much the better when the visitor was Ulé, images of whom form the foundation of the artist's legend. Walking through with the past so present in the present, it became almost impossible to separate the auratic power of the archive from the extreme now that generates, especially after the artist has died, the ghost. Perhaps this is the ultimate meaning of the reperformance of Imponderabilia. All pasts, presents, and futures coexist in the present. Indeed, the artist cannot age. Substitute bodies and digital bodies stand in for her once young self. This untimely production of ghosts is in no way unique to the art world. No, not at all. It is as relevant in music history and internet art as it is in considering how best to preserve performance while retaining its value as a mechanism for questioning the experiences we have with art, the role of the artist in society, and imagining new ways of interacting in the world. I have audio, right? Do I have audio? Okay. I don't think so. What would have been Glenn Gould's 74th birthday, some 25 years after his death, marked instead a second birthday as a ghost of his 23-year-old self. Famous for his 1955 recording of Bach's Goldberg Variations, the Yamaha company produced a disc for their disc clavier.
Glenn would have loved nothing better than to give live concerts without having to be there, and we make that possible.
I couldn't resist. I know that's a cheap shot. Let's see, how can I... Okay, get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, the Yamaha company produced a disc for their disc clavier that is based precisely, including microtones, on his 1955 performance. It is now possible to see Goldberg's Ghost perform that historically important work. But there's a catch. Although he famously loathed the limelight, Gould did take the trouble to record a second version in 1981, which he liked better, and which is not the version his Ghost plays. Rather, like the Ghost with unfinished business and a particularly troubling sight, he is condemned to play forever the 1955 version. What happens when we take this logic to the online version of Imponderabilia? If we're to go by the choice of performers in the show, the work can only be performed by the young artist, whose gracious form was an invitation to the passerby, and who, with Ule, formed a kind of sensuous sandwich from one viewpoint or an intensely awkward choice from another. Can we imagine a future world when Abramovich has decoupled herself from the extreme now of herself as both young and old, historic, high-risk performer, and regal and elegant grande dame of the art world, and receded into a ghost world as a kind of ever-young avatar shown here? We need to ask ourselves now, while many of these artists are still around. And if this is the best choice for performance, whose value lies in what it teaches us about encountering the world afresh in our bodies, our now bodies, right now. We could ask similar questions of performative objects from the same period. A reperformance of Capro's Fluids depicts the careful insistence on the kind of blocks and the scale of the rectangle, affecting once again the extreme now. Even the latter in this image from Cooper Union seems to be playing the part of the ghost's double to its distant cousin in Pasadena some 40 years earlier. That the new versions would get special lighting that makes them more beautiful than the original seems to augur poorly for the form. As in the MoMA performances, it's like giving a facelift to a corpse. It looks better, but lacks life. A year later, however, the LA Art Girls produced the same work at the Getty, carefully and meticulously. In their camp gear and contemporary garb, the second part of the piece took on another character as the work was deconstructed. Gone was the cloying attention to historic detail. Rather, the past was present enough to get them started, then banished, existing as a starting point, a way to encounter creativity anew, play it, riff on it, reject it, and adapt it to the needs of the present. As this piece indicates, the problem of ghosts and reperformance is ameliorated by attacking the emphatic presence in the genre, an emphasis on authorship and that inheres in the extreme now. Much might be gained from the lessons of live music, or at least the way the score functions in improvisational music with regard to the problem of ghosts, avatars, and zombies in reperformance art. The Annals of Performance Art offer precisely this model. Okay. The type of performance score shown here, called events and invented by George Brecht in John Cage's famous 1958 class in experimental composition at the New School, was intended to be executed simply and repeatedly. In some ways, they are extractions of elements of Cage's music, as shown here. Those of you in the back can't see. I've isolated a little piece from Cage's water music that says, "Pour water from one receptacle to another and back again." So it's a little bit like Brecht's score. Part of the audience and artist interest lies in seeing how the score will be used or interpreted each time, as it has now consistently for over a half-century. Adjustment and interpretation are intrinsic to the event structure. This actually reminds me a lot of what Hannah Hurling was doing this morning with the Zen for Film. Especially given that Fluxus events appeared first in a classroom, it comes as no surprise that they've been used repeatedly in classrooms for decades. As long as the structure remains minimal, the material simple, and the performer's attitude affectless, as opposed to acting the artistic historic self, the work can be performed any number of ways. The upper right-hand image here is from a classroom in New York in 2013, with many kinds of containers and repeated durations. Brecht's strip music has been performed atop a ladder, at a sink, on a table, and in the miniature performances of Ben Patterson with an eyedropper. The fact that the event is scored suggests a variety of possible encounters, both in the presence and absent of the artist. This is why event scores could be and were published as cards in newsletters and in magazines, and also why they continue to be so. Far from opening up the score to any and all manner of interpretation, this view of events suggests a mediated attention simultaneously to the past and present. Instead of an extreme now, with its parade of ghosts, zombies, and avatars, the event remains open to reinterpretation. No re-performance here, just performance, impure and not so simple. Following his death, Cage was very successful in not ghosting about, despite his important legacy. There is a great deal of openness in how his work is performed, even as careful scholars defend original versions. Indeed, his posthumous retrospective, Roly Holy Over, incorporated the work of others and was constantly rehung. No boring seances, no overdetermination of one version of the story, no ghost speaking, no extreme now. Ironically enough, given the problems I had with the Abramovich show at the same museum, during the Yoko Ono show this summer, audience members were invited to get into the bag of her famous bag piece. I have a little clip here from Blake Gopnik's review. Bracketing out the noise and people of the museum, encountering the quiet of life in the bag, literally put the audience member of today into an experience of the work, both at the sensory level of the past bag occupants, but equally and arguably more importantly, as they trade places with the erstwhile performers of the work. The first artist using reperformance outside the generation of artists covered here was probably Tania Bruguera, whose 1985 work, Tribute to Ana Mendieta, was largely unknown until 2010. By her account, the early performances of the piece were performed in Cuba at Fototeca de Cuba to bring, quote, to bring Ana back to Cuba, from whose cultural memory the state was trying to erase her. Admirable goals notwithstanding, the careful mimicry of these early works effects a haunting at worst, since Mendieta is dead, or possession at best, since Bruguera took the part of Mendieta in the work. Significantly, in 1996, she destroyed virtually every trace of the series after a final performance at the Institute of International Visual Art in London, a gesture that emphasized the core conflict of the work with regard to the artist's presence. By the time of her retrospective at SUNY Purchase in 2010, she had turned the practice of substituting other bodies for her own she had turned to the practice of substituting other bodies for her own in the presentation of her historic performances, effectively critiquing her own earlier position with regard to the role presence was playing in the phenomenon of reperformance. Enacted by someone else, and minus the omnipresence of historic photographs next to these bodies, the earlier work became a score or point of origin designed to be interpreted anew for subsequent performances. In his review of the show, amusingly titled "The Artist is Absent," since the Abramovich show was happening at the same time, Argentine critic Daniel Quiles described the show as enacting, quote, a de-individualization of performance as biography, end quote, since Bruguera substituted other bodies for her own and enabled them, crucially, to reinterpret her works. Most presciently for today's discussion, in Tatling's Whisper No. 6, people could come to a podium and speak for 1 minute on anything. Performed in Havana in 2009, the first version of the piece invited audience members to speak about anything at an open microphone for 1 minute. They would be escorted to and from the microphone by people dressed in military garb, and during their speech, a dove would be placed on their shoulder, a parody of the trained doves that landed on Fidel Castro's shoulder in a historic 1959 speech. The mechanics of the work, its time limits, and the escorts and dove effectively parodied the limits of speech in Cuba, and the piece was shut down after 1 minute. The work functioned very differently at the Neuberger, however, where speakers were likewise brought to the stage by actors in military uniform, and which included the doves. Not surprisingly, in a society as apparently open as ours, but where self-censorship rules the day, there was very little to say, and no one took to the microphone. Bruguera returned to Cuba in December of 2014 to re-perform the work at the Plaza of the Revolution in order to draw attention to the oppression of the Cuban people in light of historic changes that month between the governments of Cuba and the U.S. She was arrested, and the work, or rather the widespread distribution of the score as a stable instruction in changing environments, became an international cause as Bruguera's friends sought to get her and the group of dissidents caught up in the sweep out of jail. Bruguera remains in Cuba because she is not guaranteed re-entry. This is, to my mind, re-performance, or rather performance, at its best, and only incidentally because it has become associated with the broader cause of human rights. The artist may be present, to be sure, but can also be absent. The score is set, its contexts, what it does to its world, to the people that cross its path, experience it, resist it, love it, hate it, but most importantly embody it, changes over time. We do well to remember what is arguably the strongest message in the best art performance. Whether in body, mind, by place, space, or in the handling of things, you can't step in the same river twice. Thank you.
No. Any urgent questions? We have 5 minutes, actually.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. But it just seems that there's a lot of diverse works here that have been that are performed or reperformed, and it seems that the nature of what happens when a historical work is done has a lot to do with the initial circumstances of it, and I mean, for example, I guess I'm not so sure about the Glenn Gould example, because he was someone who became obsessed with recording technology, and who, in fact, as you surely know, devoted the latter part of his life to recordings as opposed to concerts, believing in fact that the recording that could be very literally reperformed would be a better record than the public one-time concert. So I guess I'm wondering how to incorporate the perspective of people exactly like him who are very precisely thinking about the future of those works.
Yeah, I think that's such a good, really an excellent point. And the point, I wasn't trying to say, I tend to write things that get really big and then I have to cut. So I had a section at one point saying that we need not fear the ghosts, right? The point is not to banish the ghosts. The point is to know that they're there and not to make a sort of pretense of not, and to kind of have a different relationship to that idea, because the emphasis of the body in so much performance is I mean, whether it's Capro or Schneemann, it's all about the nowness of it. And the issue I have with so much reperformance is the knowing exactly how the piece ends, right? It's that we all know how that piece ends. We know what we're supposed to feel when we go through it, and we lose that element of not knowing, which actually is what made the first versions so rich. So that's why I tend to favor even some of the most amateur versions of interacting with this stuff, because they have that, they retain some of that not knowing, some of that fun. Glenn Gould is such an interesting example, because it's true, he absolutely embraced the technology, but never has one performer actually been so affiliated with a single piece of music as he is with that exact piece. I mean, I can't think of another example. And that means, I mean, that is what essentially turns that performance of that musical piece into something that resonates with elements of performance art that I think is quite unique to him, and quite distinct from, say, another really excellent performer of virtually anything else. So it's actually kind of a very specific, it has to do with his role vis-a-vis music, the history of musical recording. But I mean, it's such a good point. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
And taking on what you just spoke about in terms of knowing the end of a performance. So I'm curious to hear what you think about performance entering into museums, because the actual action of them coming into a museum almost kind of forces them into this structure, and therefore it's sort of like you have staff that is going to create that situation by the process of it entering into a museum. So how do you, I mean, you want to maintain this history, and one of the ways to maintain the history is to have a museum display it, but at the same time it's working against exactly what your point is right there.
So for me, giving a lot of license to folks who want to interact with the historic material, actually letting them be artists with it, is an extremely dynamic way to curate it, right? It doesn't mean, as I say, we need not fear the ghost, but when you bracket yourself completely and try to become like Capro right down to the match, I have a problem with that. That for me is very, very complicating problem. One of the so some of you know both of my parents are Fluxus artists. That's kind of how I got involved in this, and I love this story of when my mother did. She has a piece called The Identical Lunch, and the score for that piece is 2 pieces of whole wheat toast, butter, no mayo, and a cup of soup or buttermilk, right? And so she spent about a decade keeping very close record of the lunches she had at this one diner, Riss Foods, down in Chelsea. It doesn't exist anymore. But she would say, tuna fish a little soupy today, or cost a penny more, wonder why. And she kept these, and there were 2 different journals of The Identical Lunch that were published. And so when the Silverman collection entered Semi Modern Art, they invited her to do a month of lunches, which is great. I couldn't be happier than to have, her get to do this thing. So the recipe goes to the cook in the cafeteria. And the version of the lunch that they served for the month was a tuna fish sandwich on whole wheat toast, butter, no mayo, and a cup of soup or buttermilk. But no mayo didn't mean no mayo on the bread. The way the chef interpreted it was no mayo in the tuna fish salad, which is totally different than her initial intent. And she loved the misreading. So, and so that for me is a kind of any way that an institution can protect, obviously, that the legacy, the archives, these things need to be protected, but not in a way that hampers their development. I mean, I think a lot of what I'm hearing today, and I'm so happy because it's so different than even 3 or 5 years ago, is a kind of wanting to let these things live, to really keep them vital by allowing them to change, because it'll be just awful. It'll be so bad, 50 years from now, you see people coming out in some sort of hokey version of what they thought people wore in the 60s, doing these pieces. Anyway, I've gone over 5 minutes, but thank you, Hannah. This was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hannah Higgins. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, wonderful performance. Perhaps we can re-perform it once. Who knows? What is now on the schedule is actually a coffee break, so I invite everyone to join us outside this lecture hall for a little cup of coffee, and we'll reconvene at 3:15 for the presentation of Sarah Cook, followed by presentation of Andrew Roski. Thank you very much, and see you here at 3:15.